What is Art? By Leo Tolstoy. Chapter 13. How far the people of our circle and our time have lost the capacity to take in real art, and how used they have grown to accepting as art things that have nothing in common with it, is best seen in the works of Richard Wagner. Of late, these works have been valued and acknowledged more and more, not only by Germans but by the French and the English too, as the very highest art, the art that has opened new horizons. The peculiarity of Wagner's music, as everyone knows, is this: music is to serve poetry and to express every shade of the poetic work. The joining of drama to music was invented in Italy in the 15th century in an attempt to restore what people imagined the ancient Greek drama with music to have been. It is an artificial form. It had success, and still has success, only among the upper classes, and even then, only when gifted musicians like Mozart, Weber, and Rossini took fire from a dramatic subject and gave themselves freely to their inspiration, letting the text bow to the music. In their operas, what mattered to the listener was the music alone, set to a certain text, and never the text itself. The text could be pure nonsense, as it is in the Magic Flute, and it still did not spoil the artistic impression the music made. Wagner wants to reform the opera by making the music submit to the demands of poetry and merge with it. But every art has its own field. The fields do not coincide, they only touch. And so if you join into one whole, the manifestations of not merely many arts, but even two, the dramatic and the musical, then the demands of one art will make it impossible to meet the demands of the other. That is exactly what has always happened in ordinary opera, where the dramatic art submitted to the musical, or rather gave way to it. But Wagner wants the musical to submit to the dramatic, and wants both to appear at full strength. This is impossible. Every work of art, if it is a true work of art, is the expression of the artist's most intimate feelings. It is entirely exceptional. It resembles nothing else. That is true of a work of music, and just as true of a work of dramatic art, if it is real art. For a work of the one art to coincide with a work of the other, the impossible would have to happen. Two works of art from different fields would have to be utterly unlike anything that had ever existed before, and at the same time coincide and be exactly like each other. That cannot be. There are no two men exactly alike, and no two leaves on a tree exactly alike. Still less can two works from different fields of art, one musical and one verbal, be exactly alike. If they do coincide, then either one of them is a work of art and the other a counterfeit, or both are counterfeits. Two living leaves cannot be exactly alike. Only two artificial leaves can. It is the same with works of art. They can coincide completely only when neither of them is art, but an invented semblance of art. Poetry and music can be joined, more or less, in a hymn, a song, a ballad. But even there, the music does not track every line of the text, as Wagner wants it to. There the two together produce one and the same mood. And this works only because lyric poetry and music have, in part, one and the same aim: to produce a mood. The moods that lyric poetry and music produce can coincide, more or less. Yet even in such unions, the center of gravity always lies in one of the two works. One of them makes the artistic impression, and the other goes unnoticed. And between epic or dramatic poetry and music, no such union is possible at all. Besides, one of the chief conditions of artistic creation is the artist's complete freedom from every kind of preconceived demand. Having to fit your musical work to a work of poetry, or the other way round, is precisely such a preconceived demand. It destroys any possibility of creation, and so works fitted to one another in this way always have been, and always must be, not works of art but only semblances of art. The music in melodramas, the captions under pictures, illustrations, opera librettos. Wagner's works are of that kind. And here is the proof. Wagner's new music lacks the chief mark of every true work of art: wholeness, an organic life in which the smallest change of form disturbs the meaning of the whole. In a real work of art, a poem, a drama, a picture, a song, a symphony, you cannot lift one line, one scene, one figure, one bar out of its place and set it somewhere else without damaging the meaning of the whole. It is like taking an organ out of a living body and putting it in another place. You cannot do it without destroying the life. But in Wagner's music of the last period, apart from a few slight passages that carry an independent musical sense, you can make transpositions of every kind. You can put what came first at the end, and the end at the beginning, and the musical sense will not change. And the reason it does not change is that the sense of Wagner's music lies in the words, not in the music. The musical text of Wagner's operas is like what a certain kind of versifier might produce. There are many such men now. They have twisted their language into a tool that can turn out lines on any subject, to any rhyme, in any meter, lines that will look like lines with a meaning. Suppose such a man decided to illustrate a Beethoven symphony or sonata, or a ballade of Chopin, with his verses. To the first bars which have one character, he writes verses that in his opinion match those bars. To the next bars which have a different character, he writes other verses that in his opinion match those, with no interconnection to the first, and without rhyme and without meter. Such a piece of writing, stripped of the music, would stand to poetry exactly as Wagner's operas stand to music when you hear them without the text. But Wagner is not only a musician, he is also a poet, or both at once. To judge Wagner, you must know his text as well, the very text the music is supposed to serve. Wagner's chief poetic work is his version of the Nibelungs. In our day, this work has taken on such enormous importance and has such influence on everything that now passes for art, that every man of our time needs some idea of it. I read carefully through the 4 little books in which this work is printed, and I made a short summary of it. I strongly advise the reader to go to the text itself, so as to form some notion of this astonishing work. It is a model of the crudest counterfeit of poetry, crude to the point of absurdity. But people say you cannot judge Wagner's works without seeing them on the stage. This past winter, the second day, or second act, of this drama was given in Moscow. It is the best of the whole, so I was told, and I went to the performance. When I came in, the huge theater was already full from top to bottom. There were grand ducas in the flower of the aristocracy, of the merchant class, of the learned world, and of the middling official public of the city. Most of them held librettos, and were working out the meaning. Musicians, some of them old gray-haired men, followed the music with the scores in their hands. The performance was clearly an event of some kind. I was a little late, but they told me the short prelude that opens the act means very little, and that missing it did not matter. On the stage, among sets meant to represent a cave in a rock, in front of some object meant to represent a smith's forge, sat an actor. He was dressed in tights and a cloak of skins, with a wig and a false beard. His hands were white, soft, and unused to work. You could tell he was an actor by his easy movements, and above all by the belly and the absence of muscle. He was striking with a hammer of a kind that has never existed, on a sword of a kind that could never exist, and striking in a way no one ever strikes with a hammer. And at the same time, opening his mouth in a strange manner, he was singing something you could not understand. Music from various instruments went along with these strange noises he was making. From the libretto you could learn that this actor was supposed to represent a mighty dwarf who lives in a grotto and is forging a sword for Siegfried, whom he has raised. You could tell he was a dwarf because the actor walked the whole time with his tight-clad legs bent at the knee. For a long while he went on, still opening his mouth in that strange way, half singing and half shouting. The music meanwhile picked its way through something odd, beginnings of things that never went on and never came to an end. From the libretto you could learn that the dwarf was telling himself about a ring. A giant has got hold of it, and the dwarf wants to win it back through Siegfried. Siegfried needs a good sword, and forging that sword is what the dwarf is busy with. After a long stretch of this conversation, or singing to himself, other sounds suddenly break out in the orchestra, again something that begins and does not end, and a second actor comes in with a horn over his shoulder, together with a man running on all fours dressed as a bear, and he sets the bear on the smith dwarf, who runs about without ever unbending the knees of his tight-clad legs. This second actor is supposed to represent the hero himself, Siegfried. The sounds that come from the orchestra as he enters are supposed to represent Siegfried's character, and they are called Siegfried's leitmotif. These sounds are repeated every time Siegfried appears. Every character has one such fixed combination of sounds. The leitmotif comes back each time the character it represents appears, and even when someone merely mentions a character, you hear the motif that belongs to him. Nor is that all. Every object has its own leitmotif or chord. There is a motif for the ring, a motif for the helmet, for the apple, for fire, for the spear, the sword, the water. The moment anyone mentions the ring, the helmet, or the apple, out comes the motif or chord of the ring, the helmet, the apple. The actor with the horn opens his mouth just as unnaturally as the dwarf does, and for a long time chants out words at the top of his voice. And in the same chant, Mime answers him. Mime is the dwarf's name. The sense of this conversation, which you can only discover from the libretto, is that Siegfried was raised by the dwarf, that for some reason he hates the dwarf for it, and that he keeps wanting to kill him. The dwarf has forged Siegfried a sword, but Siegfried is not satisfied with it. From this conversation, which runs to 10 pages in the libretto and takes half an hour on the stage, all of it chanted with the same strange opening of the mouth, we learn that Siegfried's mother bore him in the forest, that the only thing known about his father is that he had a sword, that the sword was broken, that the pieces are in Mime's keeping, that Siegfried knows no fear and wants to leave the forest, and that Mime does not want to let him go. All through this conversation the music never once forgets, at the mention of the father, the sword and the rest, to bring in the motifs of those people and things. After these conversations, new sounds break out on the stage, the sounds of the god Wotan, and a wanderer appears. The wanderer is the god Wotan. He too wears a wig, he too wears tights. He stands in a foolish pose with a spear, and for no clear reason, tells everything that Mime cannot possibly fail to know, but that the audience has to be told. And he does not tell it plainly. He tells it in the form of riddles, which he orders to be put to him, and he stakes his head for some reason on being able to answer them. And whenever the wanderer strikes the ground with his spear, fire comes out of the ground, and the orchestra gives you the sounds of the spear and the sounds of the fire. The orchestra goes along with the conversation, artfully weaving in, all the time, the motifs of the people and objects being spoken of. Besides that, the music expresses feelings in the most naive way possible. Fearful things are sounds in the bass, frivolous things are quick runs in the treble, and so on. The riddles have no purpose except to tell the audience who the Nibelungs are, who the giants are, who the gods are, and what happened before. This conversation, too, is chanted, with the mouth strangely gaping, and it runs to 8 pages of the libretto, and takes correspondingly long on the stage. Then the wanderer leaves. Siegfried comes back and talks with Mime for another 13 pages. Not one melody in all that time, only the endless interweaving of the leitmotifs of the people and things being discussed. The conversation is about Mime wanting to teach Siegfried fear, and Siegfried not knowing what fear is. When it is over, Siegfried seizes a piece of what is meant to be the broken sword, saws it up, lays it on what is meant to be the forge, welds it, hammers it out, and sings, Hee-a-ho, hee-a-ho, ho-ho, 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 ho-hey-o, ha-ho, ha-hey-o, ho-ho. And that is the end of Act 1. The question I had come to the theater to settle was settled for me beyond any doubt. It was settled as surely as the worth of that story by a lady I know was settled when she read me the scene between the maiden with the loose hair and a white dress and the hero with 2 white dogs and a hat with a feather in the style of William Tell. From an author who can compose false scenes like the ones I had just seen, scenes that cut the aesthetic sense like knives, there is nothing whatever to hope for. You can safely conclude that everything such an author writes will be bad because he plainly does not know what a true work of art is. I wanted to leave, but the friends I was with begged me to stay. You cannot decide on the strength of one act, they said, and the second will be better. So I stayed for the second act. Act 2, night. Then dawn breaks. The whole piece, in fact, is crammed with dawns, mists, moonlight, darkness, magic fires, thunderstorms, and the like. The scene is a forest, and in the forest a cave. A third actor in tights sits by the cave, representing another dwarf. Dawn breaks. In comes the god Wotan again with his spear, again in the guise of a wanderer, again his sounds, and new sounds too, the deepest bass that can be produced. Those sounds mean that the dragon is speaking. Wotan wakes the dragon. The same bass notes are heard deeper and deeper. First the dragon says he wants to sleep, then he crawls out of the cave. The dragon is played by 2 men in a green skin like scales. At one end they wave a tail, at the other they open a jaw stuck on the front like a crocodile's, and out of the jaw shoots fire from an electric bulb. The dragon, who is supposed to be terrifying, and who might well terrify a 5-year-old, roars out some words in a bass voice. All of it is so stupid, so much like a booth at a fair, that you wonder how anyone over the age of 7 can sit through it with a straight face. And yet thousands of half-educated people sit there listening closely, watching and admiring. Siegfried comes back with his horn, and mime with him. The orchestra sounds their motifs, and Siegfried and mime discuss whether Siegfried does or does not know what fear is. Then mime goes off, and the scene begins that is meant to be the most poetic of all. Siegfried lies down in his tights, in what is meant to be a beautiful pose, and by turns falls silent and talks to himself. He dreams, he listens to the birds singing, he wants to imitate them, so he cuts a reed with his sword and makes a pipe. The dawn grows brighter and brighter, the birds sing, Siegfried tries to imitate the birds. In the orchestra you hear an imitation of birds mixed in with sounds that match the words he is speaking, but Siegfried cannot manage the pipe, so he plays his horn instead. This scene is unbearable, of music, that is, of the art that serves as a means of tarrying a feeling the author has lived through. There is not a trace. There is something that musically is entirely unintelligible. In a musical sense you keep hoping, and the hope is dashed at once. A musical thought seems to begin, and it breaks off immediately. Whenever something like the beginning of music does appear, it is so short, so clogged with complications of harmony, with orchestration, with effects of contrast, so unclear, so unfinished, and the falseness on the stage is meanwhile so revolting that it is hard even to notice, let alone be infected by it. Above all, the author's deliberate purpose is so audible and so visible, from the first note to the last, and in every note between, that you see and hear neither Siegfried nor the birds, but only a narrow, self-satisfied German of bad tone and bad taste, with the falsest possible ideas about poetry, who is trying in the crudest and most primitive way to carry those false ideas of his over to me. Everyone knows the feeling of distrust and resistance that an author's visible intention calls up in us. A storyteller need only announce in advance, "Get ready to cry," or "Get ready to laugh," and you may be certain you will do neither. But when you see an author prescribing tender emotion over something that is not touching at all, something that is either laughable or repellent, and when you see besides that the author is quite sure he has captivated you, then a heavy, tormenting feeling comes over you. It is what anyone would feel if an old, ugly woman put on a ball gown and spun about in front of him, smiling, certain of his admiration. And the impression was made stronger still by the 3,000 people I saw around me, who not only submitted meekly to all this incoherent nonsense, but felt it their duty to be delighted with it. Somehow I sat through the next scene as well, the entrance of the monster with its bass notes woven into Siegfried's motif, and the fight with the monster, all the roaring, the fires, the swinging of the sword. Then I could bear no more, and I fled from the theater, with a feeling of disgust that I cannot forget even now. As I listened to this opera, I could not help picturing a decent, intelligent, literate working man from the country, one of those wise and truly religious men I know among the common people. And I imagined the terrible bewilderment such a man would fall into, if he were shown what I saw that evening. What would he think if he learned how much labor had gone into this performance? And if he saw that audience, those great men of the world whom he has been taught to respect, old men, bald men, men with gray beards, sitting silent for 6 solid hours, listening closely and watching all this foolishness? And leave the grown working man aside. It is hard to imagine even a child over 7 who could take an interest in this stupid, disjointed fairy tale. And yet an enormous audience, the flower of the educated upper classes, sits out these 6 hours of insane spectacle, and goes home imagining that, by paying its tribute to this foolishness, it has earned a fresh right to call itself advanced and enlightened. I am speaking of the Moscow public. But what is the Moscow public? It is 1/100th part of that public, which considers itself the most enlightened of all, and which counts it a merit to have lost the capacity for being infected by art so completely, that it can not only sit through this stupid sham without revolt, but can even be delighted by it. At Bayreuth, where these performances began, people who consider themselves the most refined and cultivated came together from every corner of the earth, spending something like 1,000 rubles a head to see this spectacle. They sat and watched and listened to this nonsense and this falsehood. But why did they go? And why do they still go? And why do they admire it? The question puts itself, how is the success of Wagner's works to be explained? I explain it this way. Thanks to the exceptional position he was in, with a king's resources at his disposal, Wagner made very skillful use of every device for counterfeiting art that the long practice of false art has developed, and he put together a model counterfeit work of art. and that is why I took his work as my example. In none of the counterfeits of art known to me are all the tricks by which art is counterfeited united with such mastery and such force. Those tricks are these: borrowing, imitation, strikingness, and interest. Beginning with a subject taken from antiquity and ending with mists and risings of the moon and sun, Wagner uses in this work everything that is held to be poetic. Here is the sleeping beauty, and water nymphs, and subterranean fires, and gnomes, and battles, and swords, and love, and incest, and a monster, and singing birds. The whole arsenal of the poetic is put to work, and everything in it is imitation. The sets are imitation, the costumes are imitation. Everything is made just as archaeology says it must have been in ancient times. Even the sounds are imitation. Wagner was not without musical talent, and he thought up sounds that imitate the blows of a hammer, the hiss of red-hot iron, the singing of birds, and so on. Besides that, everything in this work is in the highest degree striking in its very oddities: the monsters, the magic fires, the scenes that take place underwater, the darkness the audience sits in, the invisible orchestra, and the new combinations of harmony that had never been used before. And on top of all that, everything is interesting. The interest is not only in who will kill whom, and who will marry whom, and whose son is whose, and what will happen next. The interest also lies in the relation of the music to the text. The waves are rolling in the Rhine. Now how will the music say that? An evil dwarf appears. How will the music say evil dwarf? How will the music say the sensuality of this dwarf? How will music express courage or fire or apples? How will the leitmotif of the speaker be woven into the leitmotifs of the people and things he is speaking about? And there is a further interest in the music itself. This music departs from every law that has been accepted before, and the most unexpected and wholly new modulations appear in it, which is very easy and quite possible in music that has no inner law of its own. New dissonances are resolved in new ways. That too is interesting. So the poetic, the imitative, the striking, and the interesting are carried in these works to the last degree of perfection, thanks partly to the peculiarities of Wagner's talent and partly to the advantageous position he stood in, and they work on the spectator by hypnotizing him, in the way a man would be hypnotized if he listened for several hours to the ravings of a madman delivered with great oratorical skill. People say you cannot judge without seeing Wagner's works at Bayreuth, in the dark, with the orchestra hidden under the stage, and with the performance brought to the highest possible perfection. And that is exactly what proves that the matter has nothing to do with art and everything to do with hypnosis. The spiritualists say the same thing. To convince you that their visions are real, they generally say, you cannot judge. You must try it. Come to a few seances. That is, sit in silence in the dark for hours on end in the company of half-mad people and do it 10 times over, and you will see everything we see. And of course you will see it. Only put yourself in such conditions and you will see whatever you wish to see. You can get there more quickly still by drinking a lot of wine or smoking opium. It is the same when you listen to Wagner's operas. Sit in the dark for 4 days in the company of people who are not quite normal, subjecting your brain, through the nerves of hearing, to the strongest possible action of sounds calculated to excite it, and you will certainly be brought into an abnormal state and be enraptured by absurdities, and you do not even need 4 days for that. The 5 hours of a single performance, as in Moscow, are quite enough, and not even 5 hours. 1 hour is enough for people who have no clear idea of what art ought to be, and who have decided in advance that what they are about to see is beautiful, and that indifference or dissatisfaction with the work would only prove them uneducated and behind the times. I watched the audience at the performance I was at. The people who led the whole audience and set the tone were people who had been hypnotized beforehand and were now falling back under a familiar hypnosis. These hypnotized people, being in an abnormal state, were in complete rapture. Then there were the art critics. They lack the capacity for being infected by art, and they therefore always prize above everything the works in which everything is a matter of the intellect, works like Wagner's opera. They too gave the work their profound approval, since it offers such rich food for cogitation. And behind these two groups came the great city crowd, indifferent to art, its capacity for being infected by art perverted and partly withered away, led by its princes, its rich men, and its patrons, always ready like poor hounds to run with whoever states an opinion the loudest and the most decidedly. Oh yes, of course, what poetry! Amazing, the birds especially. Yes, I am completely won over. So they go on, repeating in their various voices exactly what they have just heard from the people whose opinion they take to be worth trusting. And if there are people who are offended by the nonsense and the falsehood, they keep timidly silent, as sober men keep timidly silent among drunks. Crude, false work, with nothing in common with art, travels all around the world thanks to the mastery of its counterfeit, costs millions to stage, and goes on perverting, more and more, the tastes of the upper classes and their idea of what art is.